Major General Schäfer, Brigadier Generals Agmon and Segoli, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to get this opportunity to speak to you about air power from a NATO and a European perspective, and maybe you can relate that to the Israeli Air Force. It's also a pleasure to get the chance to meet friends and colleagues again. It's my 6th time in Israel, and I do feel at home. It's a bit warmer than I'm used to in Norway, but Brigadier General Rosen showed us a picture or a video clip, and I saw that that must have been from the high north. Thank you for inviting me. We've had a series of presentation, and it's been a long day, so I'll get to the point and start with the bottom line up front. And the bottom line, and I don't want to insult anybody, but the bottom line is that we, airmen, in NATO countries are in many ways illiterate when it comes to air power theory, strategy and doctrine. We are smart in so many ways, masters of science and technology, but we are rather uneducated when it comes to conceptual thinking. This is critical because we have a new and uncertain security landscape, and we have a rather strained economy. European air forces must take more responsibilities to keep NATO robust, credible, and capable. And it's not so much that we have to do more with less, it's that we have to do things differently in the future. My message today is that technology is important, but we cannot afford to stay intellectually lazy. My suggested prescription is that we need to strengthen the relationship between policy and military operations. I will use my time to focus on the connection between statecraft and air power, and I offer an outline in terms of a new air power concept. Now, you may ask if the situation is that bad, because looking back over the last 100 years or so, one of the most significant changes in the character of war is the increased value and role of air power. And that may be so, but the point is that we haven't been using air power optimally. Part of the problem is that we have a flawed military doctrine and a military mindset that is anti-air power in its design. We invest in 4th and 5th generation aircraft, but we are stuck in a Napoleonic thinking of how to conduct war. I refer to this as the BCD complex. We are obsessed with battle, combat, and destruction. We are quintessentially battlefield-oriented and ground-centric rather than air-minded. We focus on war fighting rather than the real purpose of war, which is war ending and peace building. We are fixated on destroying tanks and artillery on the tactical level rather than think in terms of strategic level effects. We have a preference for invasion and occupation rather than governance and control. And why on earth would you seek to engage with the enemy in theater, on the ground, in the tactical red zone, when you can strike from a safe distance? There is no honor in giving the enemy a fair chance to kill you before you target him. We need to offer our politicians and the people that we are set to protect better options. We need to go on a quest, on a journey to advance air-mindedness. To me, air-mindedness is knowledge of and insight into air power as an instrument for policymakers and an asset for the Joint Military Commander. I suggest that we can use this three-ring model as a starting point for the application of air power. First, the outer ring is all about shape, deter, and respond. The outer ring is about national policy. We must use our air power expertise in a joint, multinational, and interagency setting. It's all about shaping your environment, deterring an aggressor from attacking you, and if push comes to shove, you must respond with force. Second, the second ring, to make yourself relevant to policy, we need to understand the basic roles of air power and how they can offer strategic effect. The second ring focuses on how air power can operationalize national policy. And third, we need to be masters of our own profession. We need leadership, we need technology, but we need to be able to think conceptually. We need to be air-minded in our way of thinking. We need to foster professional mastery of air power by drawing on the lessons of history and original thinking about the future. And that's one of our problems in the military. We're not very imaginative. We're not very creative. Let me explain the three rings model in a little bit more detail. Let me start with the outer ring. Any nation must shape its environment in peacetime, and it does so by daily activities and operations and how it selects its military infrastructure. We're talking about show of force, and you can do that through training, exercises, and presence, and exchange programs to make allies and partners familiar with your environment. You gather intelligence, you conduct risk analysis. Air policing is one example of how air power is used to shape your environment. But you might have to step it up, and we have then to talk about deterrence and reassurance as two sides of the same coin. You deter a potential foe, and you reassure your allies and partners. And we can divide this into extended and immediate action. An example of extended action is standing forces. That is, forces with higher readiness and responsiveness than normal. NATO's Readiness Action Plan is one such measure. Immediate measures can be in the form of deployment to the borders, or abroad, or forward basing. It can be no-fly zones, which is a more active form from air policing. One real-time example is that my country, Norway, together with Germany and the Netherlands, are the first three countries to establish NATO's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force. And finally, if deterrence fails, you might have to use military force, anything from limited action to the full spectrum. Now, none of this should be new to us. This is classic international relations theory, basic grand strategy thinking. We need go no further than Edward Luttwak or Bernard Brodie or Thomas Schelling to find key notions such as the paradoxical logic of strategy, the dualism of diplomacy and violence, the nature of coercion and persuasion, and the art of manipulation of risk and bargaining power. But airmen need to understand this. We need this context because this situates the utility of air power. Now, with this framework in mind, we can start talking about how air power can contribute to national policy. And I know you're familiar with this. You should all be familiar with the four classic roles of air power. If you start with the First World War, go into detail on the Second World War, and follow the history of air warfare for 100 years, including 1967, 1973, 1982, and all the wars that have happened in the last 100 years, you will realize that air power has been used in these four basic roles. One, you need control of the air. That's one point I agree with Martin van Creveld on. Let us not forget the importance of air superiority and air supremacy. We take it for granted, but let us not forget how important it is to have it. If you don't have it, the enemy has it. The mission to achieve that is offensive and defensive counter-air and suppression and destruction of enemy air defense systems. We know these things. Two, we need some sort of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. ISR. You need situational awareness. You need eyes in the sky. And three, strike. It can be strategic attack, it can be interdiction, it can be close air support, or missions against ships or submarines. And four, let us not forget maneuver or mobility. We need to get men and women and machines from A to B. We need to get food and water into the operations. We constantly have to think about these four roles and how they can provide strategic effect, and how they can meet the political and military objective of a campaign. Now, to use air power to its fullest, we need to understand that air power is a political tool. As Major General Essel said, air power is a political instrument. We, airmen, have a special responsibility here. We embody the expertise, the skills, and the competence for how to apply air power. Nobody can know that better than us. It is a profession in its own right. And what is it all about, fellow airmen? It's all about how to plan, lead, and execute an air campaign. That is what it comes down to. And in order to do that professionally, we need a theory. A theory is the foundation for a strategy that guides us in how to apply air power. And I'm sure you're familiar with the basic advantage of air power. Air power, exemplified through aircraft, can move fast without hinders of territory, from high altitude with great overview, and it can reach really far in a short period of time. This is the slogan of airmen: faster, higher, and further. But what does that mean to the politicians? What does that mean for the Joint Command? And let me offer these 8 points. First, air power is unique compared to ground and naval power when it comes to deployability. They have a very high degree of readiness. It is a great deterrent and the first political signal of seriousness. Second, air power is unique compared to ground and naval forces because of responsiveness. We can act in minutes rather than days and weeks. We can return to the scene fast if the opponent does not comply. Third, scalability. Air power can be used as little or as much as you prefer. You can start and stop in seconds and in minutes. 4, accuracy. Air power can act with an unprecedented precision from a distance. The old Murphy's Law, if you can hit the enemy, he can hit you, doesn't necessarily apply. It's not always true. 5, we can be as lethal as we want. We talk about precision of impact. Small diameter bombs reduce the risk for collateral damage. In the old days, it was all about how much you could destroy. Now it's how precise you can be not to destroy more than you have to. Which leads me to number 6. Air operations are not risk-free, but you can operate at low risk to own an enemy's lives compared to ground forces and naval operations in theater. 7, this gives the political masters and the military commanders a flexible tool. And when it's all said and done, what the politicians need in time of crisis is flexibility. They get options. Politicians need flexibility to adapt the use of force to the specific crisis at hand. And 8, the synthesis of all of this is strategic effect. You can achieve a strategic effect rather than tactical effect with air power. Your mind should be tuned towards these effects. You should not focus on the numeric game input measures, but what kind of effect you achieve. So we need to understand the utility of air power and what air power brings to the table compared to naval and ground forces. We need to think about what makes air power unique and different, rather than think about how air power can be used as an extension of ground warfare. Air power can do more than support the ground commander's scheme of maneuver, and we need to argue our case better than we have done in the past. We need to get our narrative straight. This is the utility of air power. This is how we can make a difference, and we need to insert this into our conceptual thinking. Let us now take these features towards an air-minded strategy, and we need to start with a good and useful definition of strategy. And a good definition is short and focused. And I'm very fond of this one from my friend Alan Stevens from Australia. This is the quintessence. Strategy, when everything is said and done, is the art of winning by purposely matching ends, ways, and means. And you see the user manual below. These are the 4 ingredients of strategy. Understand what you mean by winning and victory, and get the nexus of ends, ways, and means correct. Now let's try to operationalize this. Let us think a little bit about how the ends, ways, means nexus, identifying what we mean by winning and defining the ends. That is our starting point. The objective of an operation must be our starting point. We cannot discuss an operation by starting with aircraft and missiles. We have to start with the objective. Now, let us think about how we can be useful in international operations, what NATO's strategic concept refers to as crisis management, and what we call out-of-area operations, out-of-NATO operations. Such has been the name of the game for Western military operations in the last 25 years. What does the latest military engagements have in common from a NATO and European perspective? Deliberate force in 1995. What are we doing in Bosnia and Herzegovina today? Allied force in 1999. What are we doing in Kosovo today? Enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom. What are we doing in Afghanistan and Iraq today? Operation Unified Protector. What are we doing in Libya today? And the answer is, the common denominator is that we are conducting post-war reforms. We are trying to establish functioning, legitimate regimes in the countries that we have intervened. We are trying to develop good governance in these countries. We are essentially conducting security sector reform one way or another. So if that is what we end up doing, why do we not think of these terms before we start our small wars? I'm here thinking security sector reform in a wider sense, which means that we seek some sort of stability, security, and prosperity in accordance with the basic values of NATO, which is democracy, individual liberty, the rule of law, and human rights. We do this through integrity building and anti-corruption measures, and establishing decision-making procedures that are based on transparency and accountability. I'm not saying that these objectives are perfect, but at least, to quote Basil Liddell Hart, it is a better state of peace. So what strategy should we use to get to that end state, that end game of security sector reform? Well, and Itai Brun mentioned this when he talked about how we have to think in terms of systems, whether they are dynamic or whatever shape they have. We have to think of everything as systems, system of systems. And I believe we need to do this in two ways. We need to look at friends and foes as systems. What Ms. Levini said, we need to identify the good guys and the bad guys. And on one hand, we need to punish the foe, the bad guy, and you might have to destroy something or kill someone. We are, after all, talking about war, but it's better if we can paralyze that system, freeze the enemy from taking action. You can do this through a strategy of paralysis. You need to degrade and disrupt, to disintegrate and to deny, to disable and to damage. You don't have to destroy too much, and certainly not more than necessary. But in parallel with this, we have to think about the replacement. You need to support and contribute to an alternative regime, an alternative to the one that you are paralyzing or degrading. And this is the strategy of empowerment. You strengthen friendly forces by enabling and encouraging, by establishing and enhancing, by educating and enriching. These are the elements of empowerment, and you need to do that at the same time as you paralyze the enemy forces. And I find this to be a useful starting point. You strengthen your friends, however imperfect they are, and you weaken your foe. And if that is your strategy, you can start thinking about the military means that you might use to contribute to all of this, together with the political and the diplomatic and the economic, and Colonel Jeep mentioned DIME, We're talking about the comprehensive approach. We're talking about the whole of government approach. We're talking about effects-based operations in its various forms. But you have to use the asymmetric advantage of air power. And we don't have to start from scratch when we think about these things. On one hand, you have the theories of John Warden that follow the Jomini tradition of how to act through a series of checklists. Warden focuses on physical systemic paralysis. And on the other hand, we have theories of John Boyd that follows the Clausewitzian tradition of how to think rather than how to act, focusing on psychological incapacitation rather than the physical effects. And the synergy of Boyd and Warden is a great starting point for all of us to develop a theory of systemic paralysis and systemic empowerment. Now, with a clear view of the objective and a solid strategy that focuses on systems of systems, we can now turn to the weapons that should be used, the instrument of force. And as you see, the characteristics of air power offer a great advantage to policymakers and military commanders. It's not a matter whether air power is relevant to small wars or not. Air power is relevant. It's a matter of how you use air power to make the most out of it. So this, distinguished guests, is the beginning of an air-minded theory that focuses on the end game and the war winning rather than focus on war fighting, which consequently makes it unnecessarily battlefield-oriented and ground-centric. To me, this is the way out of our Freudian complex of battle, combat, and destruction. I suggest that we explore this three-ring model for the application of air power with an air-minded theory based on the strategy of systemic empowerment and systemic paralysis. And it is a common mistake in Europe to talk about how expensive aircraft are per unit rather than focus on the strategic effect that air power can offer. We have that debate in Norway. We have agreed to purchase 52 F-35s. It's a big investment, but it's always about how much does the aircraft cost per unit, and the cost goes up, rather than talk about the spectacular effect that you can get with that kind of aircraft. That said, it's fun to talk about, and you see the pictures, it's fun to talk about JAS Gripen, the Eurofighter, Rafale, F-22 and F-35, but it's necessary to talk about concepts and strategy, and we need to do that now rather than some point in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I know I'm the last line of defense here. I would argue that we can win small wars. In order to win small wars, air power is the key, but we need to use that key correctly. We must, as a first step, strengthen our civil-military cooperation by developing a forward-leaning, air-minded, unified theory. We must take into account the unique contributions of air power. We need to establish an intellectual hub for mastering air power theory, strategy, and doctrine, not only to discuss substance, but also to have an outreach program so that we can engage politicians and sister services on the air power narrative. It doesn't matter if we understand it well if we cannot communicate it to others. We need to be proficient in conceptual thought. We cannot remain conceptually illiterate as a group. We cannot afford to stay intellectually lazy. Back to the bottom line, we need to start the quest for a new air power concept, one that is tuned to the challenges of tomorrow rather than yesterday. And we need not get it perfect, because we never will, but a little bit of improvement would help. As you all know, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Thank you for listening to me.